great great uncle, and he was a black gentleman, and Carla and I, we just looked at each other and went, well, I don't know where, we have no idea. And when we were talking with Netley setting this up, she says, "Oh yeah, that's my cousin." Gave us his name,
Hmm.
and then getting into the research on Squire Clay, he's the guy that actually bought land in near Union and helped found this little town of Derry, hoping that they would make it a railroad stop. So that's the fun thing I find about history is it just kind of meanders all over like a river,
Hmm. Hmm.
and you run into the things you're trying to find at the time when you're not looking for them.
You're looking for
Well,
one thing and you stumble upon another.
and I think the two stories that we've touched on here are an important point. I mean, the exhibit is not an exhibit. Yes, all these families started in slavery, but this exhibit is not an exhibit of victims. People who were victimized. It's an exhibit of people who achieved something.
Hmm.
You know, and so much, and I think this is a lot of what some of the reaction against Black history is, but at least in so much of it is perceived as the history of all the nasty things that were done to Black people. And yes, that's part of the history, but that's not the entire history. And if we were just talking about the history of victims, it wouldn't be a very attractive thing. We are talking about the history of people who did something and accomplished things that contributed to the world we live in today.
Well, now you mentioned the town of Derry. Is it still around anymore?
It never really was. He platted out the town, but the railroad, although they made put a time for arrival there, never did have a station there. They petitioned the county to build a road to improve the road to there. The county turned them down. So the area is still there. The tracks, although they're fairly abandoned, still run there. Interestingly enough, Netley said one of her relatives is retired to a retirement community that is sitting squarely on top of where Derry was.
Okay. Okay.
And one of their ancestors had owned the property and tried to found the town there.
Hmm.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Joe?
No, not really.
Well, you mentioned earlier on about how you get this information by stories, and then to validate the stories, you do the research. And again, it's not that you don't trust the stories, but if a story is a good thing, but if you have a story that's documented, it then goes from being a story to becoming history, and that's how you make history. Uh, and when you're able to confirm that a certain person lived a certain place, and that Isaac Renfro did in fact buy his freedom for his family and himself while mining while mining lead in a lead mine, and they made something of themselves. That's a big deal, because it's not a yarn anymore. It's not just that's a nice bedtime story. It's something that actually happened. And again, it's not so much something that a black person in Franklin County did. It's something that a person in Franklin County did. Oh, and by the way, he's black.
Well, another part of the exhibit, and we have to credit my husband for doing this, is can you rattle off the title of that thing, Eugene?
Well, it's a boom, Black businesses and business people in Missouri.
And this is a traveling exhibit from the state museum.
Uh huh.
You with him being retired from state parks and working on exhibits that were in the state museum when he was in Jeff City. He knows the director and some of the other folks that are still up there. One part of the story that a lot of people don't realize, and this I have to blame on our history textbooks in school, because I had no idea until we started looking into this. After emancipation, after the war was over, after Reconstruction, but many of these people did not know how to read or write. They knew how to farm, and so they farmed, they made money, they bought land, and kind of kept an agrarian look at the world. However, they really had difficulties because no one would hire them. They would not. The after Reconstruction, and I was looking, going from, oh say 1875 until pretty much the 1940s. There were a lot of people. There were only certain jobs that people would give to African Americans. Even in the city, there were very uh, strict things about where they could live, and uh, most people, if they get out of, say, high school, they know Booker T. Washington, they know George Washington Carver. They don't know anything about the whole segregated economy, and the fact that since a lot of these people could not get jobs, they couldn't walk in, to a place of employment. A lot of them became professionals.
They couldn't even walk into a store and buy something.
Right, but a lot of them, this has astonished me. Your father was in slavery, and you have a master's or a PhD by going to one of the historically black colleges, which meant that you could then you could become a businessman, you could become a professor, you could do a lot of things. You had the education, and even though for the time being it was still in the black economy, I had no clue. For example, I grew up knowing about the Annie Malone's Children's Home. I had no
Hmm.
idea she was the first black woman millionaire based on her hair care products.
Right.
And one of the things that is in this display that we got from the state museum is one of her hot combs that apparently is used to uh, detangle African American women's hair, and which there's a lot of that stuff. It's out there, but that's what's fascinating to me beyond what's going on in Franklin County is uh, I vaguely knew about the Harlem Renaissance and the arts and everything in New York. I had no idea that there was a poet from Moberly, Missouri, who was the son of someone who was enslaved, who had got a master's degree. His man's name is Melvin Tolson. Spent his life as a college professor. Became the mayor of a small town in Oklahoma where one of the colleges were. And I got one of his books of poetry, and it was like, this is really, really good stuff. And I've got a degree in writing, and I had never heard of the gentleman before.
And you're a published poet yourself, which is why that interested you, I assume.
Right, but it interests me that you don't hear about this in school. You hear that, oh well, this was segregation. Segregation was bad. You don't hear about the successes, and in a certain way, a lot of the folks who were from Franklin County that went into St. Louis, how did Representative Clay get, his, you know, he basically went from an agrarian family into, you know, being in the Congress. And this is
If I remember correctly, he was big into labor unions too, which that kind of ensconced him in the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party has always been the party of labor unions.
my dad was a mailman, and he thought Bill Clay was the best thing since sliced bread.
Mm-hmm.
And first time I heard that, you could have knocked me over with a feather. But it was because of the fact that so many people in that wanted to get ahead who were people of color. They went and worked for the post office,
Right.
and Mr. Clay was all for postal workers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I will mention this because I lived in his district for many years when he was a rep. He had the best environmental record of the Missouri delegation. So many people make the thing about Bill Clay as the black representative, but again, this kind of comes back to me to saying it's our history. He did a lot more than just black people and civil rights, and I don't think people tend to give him a credit about that, though, because people tend to have this tunnel vision based on color, and that's sort of what we've been trying to break away with this exhibit is, hey, it's not them and us, it's only us.
Yeah, and that's you couldn't have said it better. That's the main reason I wanted to have you two on to talk about this exhibit. Now, I realize that this is January 26th, 2022. And if you look at all the things in the headlines, there's COVID, there's the stock market, there's will Russia invade the Ukraine? We're going to get a new Supreme Court justice pretty soon. I didn't want to do a story on any of that. I wanted to do a podcast on this story. As obscure as it is, it's about as Americana as you're going to get. The fact that people of one color succeeding in spite of everything else in a predominantly white area. And that's a success story. That's an American story. Like you said, it's not black people and white people and red people and yellow people. It's people. It's Americans. And until we get to that point where we really look past all that, the color stuff, we're not going to get much further than we are now. We've got to look past all that to truly get to the next step.
Yeah, and that's just going back to trying to get past that. That's one of the legacies of the slavery. We've had discussion of this when putting together the exhibit. What happened? Because slavery is as old as the human race.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened in this country was it became based on race.
Sure.
When the Roman slaves were whatever, color they captured, whether it be the Moors from North Africa or Greeks or Germans, the slaves were whatever color the subjugated people were. But once it got ensconced in this country, it became a strictly racial thing.
And the funny thing that I found out about that was in 1834 it became illegal to hold an American Indian as a slave. 1834.
So in 1833 it was legal.
Yes.
Okay.
But it was outlawed for American Indians over 30 years before it was outlawed for black people.
I also read an article once upon a time that there were a lot of American Indians who held black slaves.
The Cherokee were slaveholders. I often wondered why a lot of the Indians allied themselves with the Confederacy, since the Confederacy was interested in expanding into Indian lands. And essentially there were two things. One is you're against the federal government, and so are we. And the other is a lot of the rich and influential members of the, quote, civilized tribe, unquote, were slaveholders.
You would, and I read that and that kind of amazed me, but history is always amazing.
Well, what amazed me even more than that is especially the Cherokee Indians up in the hills. Oftentimes, if people who were enslaved could escape and actually did escape, they went up into the hills. They lived with the Indians. They